anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Bill Weichel. I'm involved with the committee, and I'm going to be kind of the MC today. We have a very full program for you speakers. I'm going to try to be as nice as I can, but I'm going to try to nip you in the bud if you're running too long. I think all of you have seen the schedule. The first thing that we want to do this morning is give opportunity for anybody that wants to enlighten us on something that's happening along the Mullan Road in their area. Is there anybody that wants to let us know about anything right now? We'll have another opportunity right at the end of lunch once you've had it, once you've listened to us for a while, you'll have the opportunity to, maybe tell something that's happening. So is there anybody? Sir, yes, sir.
A group of us, mostly out of Granite County, have been working on Gold Creek. And in fact, Kim did an article on some of the things we're working on at Gold Creek, Mullan Road, and mainly the history of Gold Creek. If anybody's got any good information, we're trying to suck it all in, and we're also passing it out on our website, which is the Granite County History blogspot.com. So I think we finally sorted out where the Mullan Road goes from Gold Creek, and maybe we'll cover that next year.
And your name? Okay. For those who didn't hear it, it's Ted Ananoli. Anybody else? Anybody else have anything? Well, good. We're already ahead of the game. So our first speaker today is Stuart Nash. I'm going to just read off of the bio that he gave us, other than the fact that he's a longtime colleague of mine. I've known Stuart for years in the surveying profession. But he has been a registered professional land surveyor for 42 years. He's currently semi-retired, performing part-time review of surveys for his last employer. He has worked in most of the western states as well as in British Columbia, Canada, which has given him a unique perspective relative to scenery, geography, and historical events. In 1998, he started writing about some of these events. His first book, The Last 300 Miles, published in BC, telling of the overland telegraph race to reach Europe before the Atlantic Cable Company. He has 4 novels available on most e-reader formats, and over the last 4 years, there's a typo here, I'm not sure what it means. His manuscript is he's working on a Mullan Road book, but his manuscript is currently being reviewed for publication. Stuart?
So I'm going to try this one. Does this work okay? I like it better than holding that big one up. So the first thing I want to do is make a correction to my name spelling in Bill. It's S-T-E-W-A-R-T. Regarding the historical book I've been working on John Mullan and the building of the military road. The publishers had that for 2 years, Idaho publisher, and over the last year, after I had made some additions to it that they requested, well, they said that they thought the book had a small potential audience. Hopefully it's bigger than this one here. But I'm going to continue looking for a publisher. So my talk today is going to be on Mullan's character. Nope, that just fell off. No pinching. Character is a way someone thinks, feels, behaves, someone's personality, one of the attributes or features that make up and distinguish an individual. Character comes from a person's circumstances, environment, what are their beliefs, and how are they developed. Character is what other people see in us and how we treat others. Along with character comes ethics, the courage of one's convictions, integrity, competency, honest, and morals. George Bernard Shaw says about character, what one does when no one else is looking. Something interesting about character has to do with a kind of an anomaly with the word. Watch this. What kind of person is Bill? Oh, he's a real character. So the first thing that comes to your mind is, well, something not right about that guy. And then compared to this, what kind of person is Bill? Oh, he's a real character. Totally different connotation, isn't it? Well, we're going to attempt to identify Mullan's values, moral, aesthetic, and material. And my presentation is based on what is found in Mullan's reports and what I found that others have said about him. So it was a warm day in early June 1847. President James K. Polk reclined comfortably in an armchair in his private office, his feet resting on a footstool. He was alone, enjoying his favorite clay pipe. The sweet tobacco smell filled the room. He had a few quiet moments before interviewing an enterprising young man. And a little tap at the door, enter. The President's personal secretary poked his head in and said, "Mr. President, your appointment, young John Mullan, is here to see you." John entered the room, took a single step forward toward the president, noticing his relaxed posture. He stood at attention, arms at his side. He offered his hand as President Polk stood up and waved it forward and had a firm grip in his shake. And Polk liked that. It showed that the young man was not intimidated. He noticed that he was short, perhaps 5'5", but was handsome and had an athletic build. His hair was dark brown, the hairline receding slightly, more than most young men. His chin was square and his lips thin. Blue eyes gave an appearance of sternness, and he seemed confident. His manners were faultless. President Polk told John to sit down and said, "Well, my little man, what can I do for you?" And Mullan was a little bit taken aback by that. He had been tagged as a little man all during his school. They called it college back then, high school years. And he felt somewhat taller now that he had graduated. He pushed the annoyance back into the back of his mind. His purpose for an audience with the president was too important to allow any distractions. "Mr. President, sir, I am here to ask for an appointment to West Point. I have several letters of recommendation from friends and acquaintances, and General Walbach is included." "Well," the president said, "don't you think you're rather small to be a soldier?" John thought quickly of a response that would change the president's mind. "I may be small, but can a small soldier be just as good as a tall soldier?" Now that scenario came from later John Mullan's wife Rebecca in her memoirs about his meeting with President Polk. So I've just added a little bit to it to kind of give a sense of what John had gone through to have an audience with the president. Young Mullan was only 16 years of age at the time. Graduated from St. John's College with honors, receiving an AB degree, had a transcript of his records, along with a letter from the college president. And then he finally did receive an appointment to the Military Academy of West Point, signed by the President of the United States. Now, what does this initial accounting of young Mullan's character show? To me, it shows that he was a brave young man. He was determined. He was not ashamed of his height. And he was an honor student. Shows a little bit of his early character. John entered West Point Academy on July 1st, 1848, at age 17. General Walbach's prediction that upperclassmen would be hard on him was very true. But through hard work, doing well in classes, and on the athletic fields, John made many friends. He was characterized by his officers as exhibiting great energy, ambition, perseverance, and a natural leader. By his classmates, he was friendly, honest, even-tempered. Often he would check out books at the library. A sense of adventure and hunger of knowledge were the books he read when he had time. Classes John took at the academy included engineering, having instructions from the brightest mind in engineering in the U.S. at the time, Mr. Alfred Thayer Mahan. Here he took drawing, learned human figure, topography, landscape, shades, shadows, and perspective, surveying, analytical geometry, English studies, French, mineralogy, geology, infantry, artillery, and cavalry tactics. He was only allowed 2 months of leave over a 4-year period. The meals consisted primarily of boiled meats. Apparently not many vegetables were given at the time. He graduated in June 1852, 15th in his class of 200, with a rank of brevet second lieutenant. Had a mere 43 demerits in 4 years, none in the third. However, he and a fellow classmate were arrested for gambling, which usually followed by dismissal. But somehow he just ended up with demerits for that. Among members of his graduation class were Philip Sheridan and George Crook. General Philip Sheridan was a Civil War hero, as well as Indian Wars, commanding general of the United States Army in 1884. General Crook, Civil War, Indian Wars. Both Sheridan and Crook graduated near the bottom of their class, and yet they turned out to be West Point legends. At school, John also learned to take observations on the sun and the stars, made computations, determined latitude and longitude. He became proficient at making and reading maps and was assigned to the 2nd Artillery, where he was further trained in the use of various surveying instruments. So what do we learn of Mullan's character from these paragraphs? At West Point, his officers said he had great energy, ambition, perseverance, was a natural leader. Classmates said he was friendly, honest, even-tempered, 15th in his class of 200. By now, John had lamb chop type sideburns reaching down to an inch or less of just below each corner of his mouth. His hairline had receded more, particularly on the left side where he parted his hair. When dressed in his military uniform, he was handsome, but he often had a stern expression on his face in the photos that I've been able to see of him, perhaps contemplating tasks at hand or topics of discussion. In April 1853, Mullan joined the Isaac Stevens campaign to find a railroad route through the northern Rocky Mountains. So what might have been Mullan's feelings about this appointment? A sense of adventure, seeing what the West was like, perhaps an assignment of his own, but not knowing he would be making history. Mullan accompanied Lieutenant Donaldson to St. Louis to acquire 10,000 rations and transport them 700 miles up the Missouri to Fort Union. Mullan's job on that trip was to conduct meteorological observations. Donaldson gave a good report to Stevens of Mullan's abilities. Consequently, he was given first command at Fort Benton to find the flatheads to the south, which he did, and was able to persuade 4 chiefs to accompany him to the Bitterroot Valley to meet with Stevens. After traveling 3 or 4 days with the 4 chiefs, Mullan was convinced that the chiefs saw Earth as a living being. All things, whether man, animal, flower, stream, creek, tree, or rock, all were living things to them. All life was sacred. And Mullan wrote this about the chiefs. We were without meat, but had a little flour left from a small stock of provisions. These being the first fish caught by any party, it was caught by one of the chiefs, they insisted on our taking them, which we refused, but still insisting we were compelled to accept them. This is certainly an example of a boundless generosity. I cannot say too much in favor of these noble men who were with us. They were pious, aged, firm, upright, and reliable men. So perhaps this shows that of Mullan's acceptance and change of heart over previous beliefs about what he had heard about the bloodthirsty Indians on the plains. And he was willing to write about his observations. He also observed that this Flatheads and the Pondereys were very religious people from the Catholic upbringing that they had in the Bitterroot Valley, or some of the teachings. I believe it was Catholic, but they would have prayers every morning and every night. Everybody in the village, even these 4 chiefs at every meal, did the same. Stevens thought highly of Mullan, bringing the 4 chiefs in his very descriptive report that he gave. So he selected him to stay the winter and conduct explorations to the south to Fort Hall, to the north almost to Canada, and then west over to Walla Walla. He had also made trips back to Fort Benton. On the trip to Fort Hall, Mullan's reports began to show his true feelings about the Blackfeet tribes and his previous thoughts on savage Indians, completely opposite of what he observed with the Flatheads. The Blackfeet's continual savagery toward most all other tribes, he called them hellhounds of the mountains and devilish fiends. At Fort Hall, he learned of the massacre of Captain Gunnison and his party in the Utah Territory, and writing in his report, he wished he had been nearer to offer assistance and hoped the Utes would be retaliated against with marked severity. On the trip to the Flathead Lake and further north, he met different Indians, some of them by themselves. He once more saw their kindness, them offering food of which they had little, and Mullan almost always tried to repay them with some form of tobacco, ammunition, leggings, whatever he had that he could do without. And even Major John Owen, who was the owner of Fort Owen in the Bitterroot Valley, knew Mullan. In fact, Mullan had hired him to guide him on the first trip into the Big Hole Valley, but John Owen got lost, and Mullan had to relieve him and give him provisions and sent him back to Fort Owen. But Major John Owen said, "I regret the departure of Lieutenant Mullan, for I found him a high-toned gentleman with pleasing manners." Isaac Stevens became the governor of Washington Territory. In his own reports, he gave high commendations to Mullan, saying, "Something more, however, is due both to Lieutenant Mullan and his party in an exploration to which he contributed so largely than the foregoing narrative of his several journeys. In the establishment of his quarters, the management of his command, and in his intercourse with the Indians, he evinced the soundest judgment, and the whole sphere of duty was filled by him in a manner entitling him to the warmest commendations. Lieutenant Mullan, besides his constant and judicious intercourse with the Indians, always assembled them in council previous to starting on any expedition, informed them of the probable absence he would have, and gave them good advice in reference to their own affairs. They were very glad to have him mediate in their disputes, and they cheerfully acquiesced in his decisions. I received from him at every opportunity reports in regard to the Indian tribes which were of the greatest service, and which enabled me better to comprehend their feelings, wants, and the proper mode of managing them. The fact that he left the valley in the fall of 1854 with a sincere regret of all the Indians who knew or heard of him is the best evidence of his service in connection with them. Not one unpleasant thing occurred during his year's sojourn in the wilderness which marred the propriety of the intercourse of his party with them or tended to diminish his influence over them." And he continued, "The individuals of Lieutenant Mullan's party had equal respect for him, and they were generally cheerful and contented and prompt to perform their duties. Yet the party was at all times on short rations of flour, sugar, coffee, and much of the time lived exclusively on meat. I received many letters from him referring to the almost entire dearth of articles which in settled communities are considered almost indispensable to sustain life, and urging the necessity of dispatching a train of supplies as soon as possible. Yet there was no complaint, and his cheerful spirit impressed itself upon all his men. I deemed it a simple act of justice to this most promising meritorious officer to say this much. His judgment and discretion were equal to his boldness and resource, with qualities which qualities had been exhibited not only in his winter exploration, but in those of the spring when the streams were up and hazardous crossings had to be made. He made remarkable contributions to existing knowledge, both of the snows, the geography of the country at a season of the year, and under circumstances when most men would have done nothing. I left with him in October nothing but disabled animals, horses, for every sound one was used in connection with other parties. The day after my departure, he moved his camp to the best grass of the valley, and on the 6th day afterward, he was in his saddle with a portion of his party, going to the waters of the mission. And such was his promptness and energy throughout." And in a letter written on January 3rd, 1855, to the Secretary of War, Stevens made these following comments. "I have the honor herewith to enclose a copy of Lieutenant Mullan's report and to recommend it to the favorable action of the department. His estimate I consider reliable and his plan of operations perfectly practicable. Should Congress make an appropriation for a military road from Fort Benton to Walla Walla, it could not be placed in better hands than Lieutenant Mullan's, and thus a test be furnished to the work on the railroad exploration as pointed out by him at a much smaller sum than is given in his estimate." So the highlights of Stevens' reports were: he had sound judgment, acceptable Indian mediator, well-written reports, respect of his men, cheerful spirit, remarkable contributions. Now, regarding those well-written reports, I was only able to obtain one of his personal journals, a part of it, from Fort Dalles to Walla Walla. It took me probably 40 minutes to go through page one. He had atrocious handwriting. How he got reports published, number one, but written on hand in the field to give to Stevens, I don't know. He just must have taken his time and written very slowly. But boy, there were times when trying to read through some of the pages, you could tell he had a hard day because they were just chicken scratches almost. But he understood them. As we all know, Mullan was given command of the military road construction. However, the Colonel Steptoe battle 90 miles north and east of Walla Walla delayed the project. Mullan requested to be a part of the Colonel George Wright campaign against the Indian and was Wright's topographical engineer. Early on, Mullan had a hand-to-hand fight in the shallows of the Snake River with an escaped Indian. As written by Lieutenant Lawrence Kipp in his book, Army Life on the Pacific, he wrote, "Thinking either of the two Indians could have been the man that shot Captain Taylor, Mullan spurred his mount forward, jumped off his horse, and ran into the river to his waist to secure one of the escapees, an athletic man of large stature. The Indian dove under as the lieutenant fired his pistol in an attempt to wound the man. The warrior rose out of the water with two heavy stones and hurled them at Mullan, striking him in the side with one. Mullan's pistol was dunked beneath the water as he attempted to ward off the stones. When he tried to fire again, nothing happened. The man rushed forward and grabbed at the pistol, their arms clenched in hand grips. Mullan tripped the Indian and they both went underwater, but up quickly, still grappling in earnest. They went under again and fought back to their feet. The Indian stepped in a hole and lost his grip with Mullan. Knowing his opponent couldn't fire his pistol, he then swam to the opposite side of the river. So for his size, Mullan was brave. I can just hear what he said as he come drenched, walking through the willows back up to his comrades. Boys, I never thought I'd get in a rock throwing contest there. Then during the Battle of 4 Lakes, Mullan helped to capture 800 Indian horses. One of them was a young Indian boy of 14 years old. And in his wife Rebecca's memoirs, she told that Mullan had pleaded for this boy's life because Stevens was going to hang him. And Stevens acquiesced to Mullan, you take care of him. So here, Mullan shows compassion for a young boy. In a handwritten letter, Colonel Wright said of Mullan, Colonel Wright, the commander of the Battle of 4 Lakes and the Spokane Plains War, the distinguished and gallant conduct of Lieutenant Mullan during the whole campaign justly entitle him to the warmest praises of the colonel commanding. As topographical engineer, the vast amount of reliable information he has obtained of a country hitherto but little known will prove highly interesting and beneficial to the country, and also of paramount importance in connection with a great military road, the construction of which the War Department has placed in his hands. After that, Mullan was in Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River for several months before returning to Washington, D.C. to lobby for additional monies for the road construction. And apparently, Mullan was not thought of so well by all. A November 23, 1858 article titled "The Bombastic Little Lieutenant," Condemnation by the Oregon Statesman. And it seems that the article had to do with the Battle of 4 Lakes and the Spokane Plains battle. And the newspaper said, Lieutenant Mullan is the individual who has had the bad taste to parade himself and his services in a vulgarly ostentatious manner through the columns of a disreputable newspaper. Aside from the fact that the lieutenant was guilty of a violation of a special order, which expressly forbids officers from blowing their trumpet of their own fame, decency should have restrained him from this painful exhibition of mingled egotism and toadyism. A crown of laurel, even when merited, sits with an ill grace upon his brow, who ostentatiously places it there with his own hands. The indelicacy and impropriety of a soldier celebrating the glory and renown of his own achievements is apparent to everybody. Caesar, it is true, wrote his own commentaries. He didn't go into ecstasies of self-gratulation when, by the aid of his sturdy legions, he had achieved a victory over the fierce barbarians of the north. He stated the facts and left his need of commendation to be awarded by his countrymen. Apparently, Brother James, who was living in Dalles, read that article. And on November 30th, 1858, in the Oregon Statement, 7 days later, "Sir, I received by last mail a letter with your signature bearing date, Dalles, Oregon, November 18th, which you announce yourself as the brother and champion of Lieutenant John Mullan, USA, and in that character demand satisfaction from me for an alleged slander of said John Mullan in the Oregon Statesman. From the windy style of your epistle, I am not permitted to doubt your relationship to the bombastic little lieutenant, and from what I can learn, I am convinced you are as great an ass as your doubtable brother." I tried to find that disreputable newspaper of that time period, and I never did come up with it. I would have loved to have read what Mullan had written. June 8th, 1859, Mullan left for Fort Dalles to begin road construction with 90 soldiers and civilians. He was escorted by Lieutenant James White's command of 140 men of the 3rd Artillery and officers Lyon and Howard. On August 2nd, 1859, Captain Pleasanton responded to Mullan's suggestion regarding an additional 30-man escort as instructed to Pleasanton by the Adjutant General, William Harney. This request is due to a threat by 700 mounted Indians. And what that threat was, if they cross any part of our Camas Route area, we will kill them all. And this is what the William Harney wrote back. "Commanding instructs me to return the enclosed communication from your secretary and to state he cannot act upon any information from the military road expedition under your charge unless such information is transmitted in a communication signed by yourself, which signature is necessary to render information official and responsible." This was Mullan's first hint of General Harney in the fact that he was not going to be a friend of this military expedition building the Mullan Military Road. Why? The topographical engineers of the Army were not in favor of Mullan's appointment. They had demanded that a member of their corps be appointed, but to their chagrin and obvious disappointment, Stevens persisted in the appointment to Mullan. That was the first of several incidents with General Harney. At the winter camp, horses and cattle died from starvation. In spite of these setbacks, in a January 3rd report, Mullan wrote, "As I was sent out to build and construct the road, it shall be constructed." Courage of conviction. It is apparent that at this winter camp that Mullan had also taken up pipe smoking, as illustrated in a sketch by artist Sohan. Well, what does that have to do with character, you ask? Well, you remember how many college professors, wise in their ways, would have a pipe in their hand and smoke, and appearing to be of high character. Well, the fact that I smoke a pipe once in a while has nothing to do with that observation. However, with a pipe in my mouth, I was kindly escorted out of a bank in Canada. Some people, when you could smoke in a grocery store, and I'd come in with a pipe. Oh, I love the smell of pipe tobacco. My grandpa used to smoke one. So now I only smoke a pipe occasionally while I'm fishing, and they don't care about my character at all. On August 18th, a local agent named Thomas Hughes, who had traveled from Walla Walla to Coeur d'Alene Mission, wrote to the Indian agent at Fort Walla Walla, Lieutenant Mullan is constructing a good wagon road and deserves credit for it. The Indians have given him the name of a little man with a big heart, and I think he deserves it. Mullan had sent Mr. B.L. Weisner, the astronomer, who took astronomical and meteorological observations to Fort Benton to make observations due to the heavy smoke in the mountains. And then he was to return to the Continental Divide to obtain readings there for latitudes and longitudes during the eclipse. But then Mullan learned that Major Blake, who had arrived with a contingent of 200 soldiers to cross the military road, Blake had dismissed Weisner and his 3 helpers because Blake thought Mullan's funds were exhausted. Mullan wrote a long communication to Major Blake and reproached him for having discharged his astronomers when there was still work for them to accomplish. He also made a number of suggestions to Blake concerning the travels he would make westward, and Major Blake was not a happy officer after that. After reaching Fort Benton in 1860 with the road construction, Mullan met a fellow West Point classmate, August V. Kautz, who would travel with Major Blake to Walla Walla. On September 14th, on the return trip to Walla Walla, Kautz described Mullan saying, Mullan entertained us in his flowing style all the evening about his road, what he has done, and what he knows. To me, that's the courage of one's convictions. He was proud of what he was doing, and he knew what this meant to bring both settlers and wagon loads of materials to the mining camps. I believe he was proud of what he was doing. Upon retiring from the military and marrying Rebecca Williamson, in 1863, John had desired to help 3 of his younger brothers, Louis, Ferdinand, and Charles, and they agreed to travel to Walla Walla and begin establishing the farm that John had purchased in 1861, I think. Mullan and Rebecca moved onto the farm, and within 16 months there, and their brothers learning of the other brother, James, obtaining an interest, it did not set with him well. Louis felt he had contributed more to the endeavor than the others and wanted the entire farm placed in his name. This caused a strife between all. And John was discouraged that Louis had become so materialistic and greedy over the property, not treating the venture equally as Mullan had set up and hoped for. John had made all the payments for the land, paid for the buildings that was built, the machinery, and the labor, while the 3 brothers gave only their labor. Disheartened, John sent Rebecca back to Baltimore so she wouldn't have to deal with the friction. John soon followed after Louis took him to court. Then there was another instance of Mullan expending a good deal of money in establishing a mail communication route from California to Idaho. He had men hired to build roads, prepare stations for overnight stays, changing horses, providing meals, and etc. And he operated for 6 months when all of a sudden a second contract was let to a competitor for twice the amount of Mullan's contract. So this put him out of business once again. But he didn't quit. He went on to obtain a lawyer's degree, and he performed work for the states of California and Oregon for claims against the federal government. Now, this book that Keith Peterson has just published, I'm certain is going to show some differences of what I have found just from the information I've given you about John Mullan. My personal reflections, I believe Mullan was a man of good character, held in high esteem by his officers, by his men, the Indians he spent time with, and later his employers at San Francisco placed him in prominent positions as an engineer, an attorney. And as with any person of his positions, there were those who had bad things to say, but none of them have 12 statues, 12 stone or pyramid monuments, 12 road signs, and 6 historical markers, a total of 42 commemorating John Mullan for his accomplishments. Numerous streets, roads, and trails bear the Mullan name in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Even a town in northern Idaho named after him. Other than perhaps Lewis and Clark, no other individual in all of the Northwest of America has such recognition for an historical event. Lieutenant, later Captain, John Mullan truly was the explorer. Though short in stature, he was a giant in the history of the American Northwest. Thank you. Time for questions, if anyone's got any. Yeah.
I've often wondered how many people total were on the Mullan Road expedition. I understood there was 110 non-military people. You just mentioned there's 140 soldiers along this total, so 250 people.
Yeah.
Do you think that's accurate?
I do.
That's a lot.
That is a lot, yeah. And the military had the same type of problems that Mullan's men had. Shoes wearing out, requested shoes to be sent to them, and they were given very poorly constructed shoes. That was one of the major things. They couldn't get the supplies from Walla Walla as they needed them as they moved along through Coeur d'Alene Valley and so on. So, but they had a lot of supplies between the two, the military organization and John Mullan's group, when they entered the St. Regis Valley and did their winter camp there. They had to move by sleigh because the wagons got snowed in, 3 feet of snow in a very short period of time. So they had to build sleds and haul their, I don't remember exactly how many tons, but something like 10 or 15 tons of goods, their food and everything that were taken to sustain them onto where they had their winter camp. And it was there that there was no feed for the horse. It was very cold, 40 below zero. And the horses died. A lot of them, not all of them. And Mullan's sent the wagon master, I think it was, to take what remained of the horses and oxen down into the Bitterroot Valley for the winter.
Because they were going through Indian territory much of this time, and some of it hostile Indian territory, do you happen to know if the civilians were armed? And if they were, that presents 250 people to ward off the attacks.
Yes, they were armed. They slept with their firearms beside them at night. And 250 firearms against 700 Indians. I don't know who's going to win, but I got a pretty good idea.
Stuart, was Mullan resigned from the Army?
You know, I don't know the answer to that.
Why did Mullan resign from the Army in the middle of the Civil War?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe he just felt he had done enough for his country. I don't know for sure. I've never read anything that indicated that. Perhaps Keith's book might.
Weren't all West Point graduates imbued, embedded, psychologically, whatever, that they are to follow orders, right?
Right.
That's still true today. If he was following Governor Stevens' order to establish a relationship with the Bitterroot Valley Indians, it may not have been his congeniality per se, as much as following orders, following railroad route options.
Yeah.
As being short, Andy Rooney and Tom Cruise, if they were told they would never become movie stars and believed it, that would be crazy. That's all retrospect. But anyway, maybe you get into this elsewhere about military graduates from the Civil War on, became very conscious that I did it because I was ordered to do it, and so on and so forth. So how much is that is Mullan's character that he acquired from getting excellent parenting as a youth versus what West Point instilled in him?
My response to that would be that knowing of some other Army officers and their treatment of Indians, having come from West Point also, were nothing like what John Mullan presented to the Indians. Being a short man, quite often people believed him to be shorter of character, perhaps, but almost all of his relations with the Indians had to be interpreted by someone to them and back and forth. That was initially what happened when he went to find the flathead south of Fort Benton. Fortunately, there was one Indian chief who spoke French there. Now, his first presentation there to them wasn't accepted hardly at all. So overnight, and then they had prayers the next day, he made another presentation, and you cannot order somebody to pour out their heart, I think, in cases like maybe would have happened then, particularly in the Bitterroot Valley, to the point where the Indians themselves would recognize. I'm going to go to him for advice. I don't think anybody can order that. That kind of character. Anyone else? Yeah.
Do you know why the monuments that we see of Mullan have the dates 1853 to 1855 on them?
Yes, the first military expedition to survey for a railroad, find a railroad route, started in 1853. Or it started in 1852, but Mullan was out here in 1853. He had made a number of trips back to, well, I don't know how many for sure. Dan would know probably. Back to Washington, D.C. from the time he first came out in 1853. So the railroad expedition was the start of the building of the military road, followed by an interstate finally, and railroads that was actually built. So that's why it's commemorated through those spans of years.
Call to record. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, STEWART.
Thank you, Bill.
I first want to apologize for my technical support, which is myself. I left this thing on the screen just because I don't know how to shut the whole thing off and make sure it comes back on. And so the files are not protected as, it might have been disconcerting. I'll try to get it covered during the next one. I guess Kim Bregeman, my whatever it is I'm doing up here, not a host, we have other hosts too, but Kim's going to introduce our next speaker.
Which one works?
I use this little thing. This is nice.
Okay, does it? Hi, I am Kim Brigham, and I'm on the planning committee for the Mullan Road Conference this year. And as those of you who have tried to do something like this before know, it has its ups and downs, its frustrations and everything. But I had a couple of eureka moments, I guess you'd call them, and one of them was when Sally Thompson answered my email and said, yes, I will speak at the conference. I don't know how many times over the past several years I've heard the phrase, I got this map from Sally Thompson. And so she says on her bio that historical trails are among her favorite things, or one of her favorite topics. And I would say that while there's a lot of us who, to borrow a word, are monomaniacal about finding the Mullan Road, I think it's fair to say that Sally is looking at the trails that preceded the Mullan Road, the historical trails, and maybe one of the foremost experts on that. Sally has spent over 30 years working with the native tribes of the West. She's trained as an anthropologist at CU, Colorado University, in 1980. She's worked as an archaeologist, ethnographer, and ethnohistorian, with a particular interest in ethnogeography through place names across traditional homelands. She has specialized in indigenous communities along the Rocky Mountains and is founder and director of the Regional Learning Project at the University of Montana for 10 years up until 2010. Sally oversaw a team of specialists with a focus on regional history, geography, and culture. During these years, she interviewed over 200 elders of 37 tribes and used the results to produce 3 documentaries and several classroom DVDs, in addition to three websites. Wow. More recently, she worked collaboratively with traditionalists from the Kootenai and Blackfeet tribes on a book about their traditional seasonal rounds through the crown of the continent, with a focus on Glacier National Park. People Before the Park is due out this year. Sally?
Need a moment to get set up here. Okay, is this going to work sound-wise? I have to work the clicker and the mic, so somebody help me out. Can you hear me in the back? No? Okay. So I'm going to need to do this and turn pages. You'll have to be patient with me. I was delighted when Kim contacted me about speaking here. Stewart mentioned that he had received some feedback that perhaps the topic was limited in terms of audience. Well, this one's much more limited, and I'm hoping this is the audience. I doubt there's anyone else in the United States that would be interested in this particular presentation. Okay, just want to give a brief background to how this came about. The road not taken by Lewis and Clark is the focus of the road we're going to look at today, right? So the red dotted line connecting the Missoula Valley to the mouth of the confluence of the the headwaters of the Clark Fork is the focus of the work that I got to do with the Confederated Tribes back in the 90s when they had a claim against ARCO, and they went in with the state of Montana against ARCO. And that claim was based on their off-reservation treaty rights, and my job was to work with them to assess, quantify, and document the losses of those rights. And so I became very, very familiar with the Clark Fork from Missoula up to Butte. And it's in learning through the tribal elders, their oral history. I read everything I could ever find in archives and journals and published documents for this particular region, and I interviewed descendants of homesteaders up and down the Clark Fork. And this place that I'd called home for 2 decades at that point became alive with those stories. And I really started to understand what the tribal people had been telling me, that those names keep those stories alive, and then that keeps the relationships to those places alive. And so where normally my writing is pretty technical, I couldn't help but write this essay that I'm going to share with you today. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that. The hot afternoon of August 11th, 1859, was cooled by a thunderstorm, leaving its essence behind in the enlivened air. All was quiet when the boys put the horses away, and continued quiet as the silhouettes of pines against the blue horizon of the Bitterroot Mountains faded into blackness. Then, like the perennial stars of Perseid shooting across the sky, Bannock horse thieves escaped through the night with some 100 Salish horses. Horses were wealth to the Salish, and this night's work left them poorly provisioned for their upcoming journey across the mountains for bison. This loss needed to be recouped, and Counting Coup had much to do with horses. Often during these years, the Salish were destitute of many things. The federal government banned the sale of ammunition to Indians and failed to supply the provisions promised in the Hellgate Treaty of 1855. 50 years after metal tools were introduced, the old ways to make stone arrow points had been abandoned by all but the most conservative old men, and they were too old to hunt. The young men were committed to hunting gear for which the government withheld the active ingredient, ammunition, creating a black market run by men who, like wolves, lurked at the forest edge, watching for weakness. The Salish hunters traded horses, hides, and dry meat, if they had any, for ammunition and iron arrow tips to see them through the buffalo hunt. On August 16, 1859, Indian Agent John Owen mentioned in a letter to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs that the Flatheads were leaving at the end of the month for their fall buffalo hunt, and he worried about potential trouble in the territory. The Indian is becoming daily more and more unsettled, some of them alarmingly so, because of the growing number of whites in the Bitterroot and the increasing scarcity of game. That spring, four years after negotiations, the Hellgate Treaty had been ratified, opening the doors for settlement of the Bitterroot Valley despite treaty guarantees to the contrary. Owen, sounding nearly desperate, explained to the superintendent that the Indian is naturally alarmed at the inroads made by the white man into their country. They say we all will be swallowed up by the white tribe. What is to become of us? Roads are being made through our country. Our game is growing scarce. In early September, most of the Salish tribe of 500 to 600 people with thousands of horses were headed east on a journey across a landscape they knew looked like a book they had read time and again. Usually the Salish, joined by Ponderay, Nez Perce, and other allies, traveled in several groups rather than en masse because few campsites could provide for all their needs and those of their horses. They traveled with dry berry cakes and roasted roots. The riverbanks were dotted with purples and reds of late-season fruit, and all along the way the people stopped to acknowledge ancient trees and buried kin. Traditional stories carried them along, helping them make good choices in a land full of peril. During this September of 1859, they likely took a high country route, like Skalkaho or Burnt Fork, to the Flint Creek Hills, where huckleberries were ripe, fish were plentiful, and the moist alpine meadows provided amply for their many horses. Late summer grasses were dry at lower elevations. Chief Victor, whose Salish name meant many horses, had been ill for over a year, and he wasn't able to lead the main camp across the mountains. Owen worried that Victor would never recover his former good health, strength, and spirits. Second Chief Moise, Crawling Mountain, was a man remembered for his courage, frankness, and honesty. He would carry the honor and burden of leadership during these difficult times. Despite trade, trapping, and disease, in many ways life had changed very little during the 50 years since the first whites arrived. Other than the tilled land around Fort Owen in the Bitterroot Valley, the sod remained unbroken. Fort Owen and St. Mary. When they stopped to camp and grazed their horses along the way, the hillsides and valleys looked much as they always did, although the game seemed more scarce. Fishing remained as it always had. Women and children collected huckleberries from lodgepole thickets, dried them, and then ground them with the pestles that they stashed there the previous year. You won't find a pestle in a Blackfoot camp. They used heavy mauls for grinding meat and berries together into pemmican cakes. The Salish never mixed the two because of some now forgotten kitchen rules. They left pestles and mauls like teepee poles at camps all along the route, ready for the next visit. The leaves on the cottonwoods were already beginning to turn as the travelers dropped down into the valley of the Arrowstone River, with its clear water where fish common as ripples rested in the shade of deep pools. As they passed the creek where Benitzi had found gold, the headmen wondered which trail to take across the Great Divide. They sent scouts up the high hill overlooking Senkoposa, where the trail splits, where enemy warriors might be waiting in ambush as the Salish followed the narrowing bend of the river leading into the valley. No signs of enemies were found, but what they saw instead on that late September afternoon was Johnny Grant's cabin. Here, where bison skin teepees had been pitched since the oldest among them could remember, now sat a rough shack of soft cottonwood logs, bark still attached. If this had been in any other tribe, some of the alarmingly unsettled young men may have thought to burn the cabin down, but the Salish elders set an honorable example, which the young people followed. Young men gathered tender branches from cottonwoods to supplement their horses' feed, and others cut willows for sweat lodge frames, while women unfurled skins across the framework of teepee poles, each one pondering the future. Would others join this cabin here at the place where fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, and old ones had camped with their wolf-like dogs and hundreds of horses year after year for generations? John Strachan, one of John Mullan's road crew members who camped that winter some 140 miles downriver in the company of some Ponderes and Salish, wrote to his brother about the Indian life he witnessed, a camp scene which might have been paralleled at Senkoposa. Early in the morning, the men leave for their hunting grounds and remain till nearly dark. All they do is kill game, and towards dark the women go and pack it in. Their food mostly consists of game, fish, roots, and fruit. The moss of trees is also eaten by them. It is made into cakes, somewhat resembling plug tobacco, with little or no taste. Some of the camas roots we purchased of them had been cooked with Oregon sunflower, which imparted to them a taste of molasses. The Salish camp may have stayed at Senkoposa until they were well stocked with venison from the Deer Cache Hills to the south, now known as the Flint Hills, west of Deer Lodge, and until they had gathered enough kinnikinick leaves for medicine and tobacco to see them through the winter, or perhaps they proceeded over the mountains with enough dried stores that they moved quickly, camping only one night, and then moving on in the crisp chill of early morning. Whichever pace they traveled, they were weighted down by the knowledge that each year they found fewer bison and farther away. Already bison were nearly gone from the common hunting ground of the Missouri Headwaters country, created by the 1855 treaty. Johnny Grant's was the only house on the trail between the Bitterroot and Fort Benton. If a person wanted to send him mail, they would have sent it on one of the boats that left St. Louis every spring, where eventually someone at Fort Benton would send it along with a traveler heading southwestward. It might take a year to hear about Lincoln's inaugural address. I was there alone, Grant reported. My nearest neighbor was at Bitterroot, 130 miles away, and Fort Benton was 185 miles. Salt Lake was 500 miles distant, but it was there I got my supplies every year. This land, which provided for all the needs of its ancient inhabitants, became a place to which supplies must be carried with great difficulty and high cost in order to create a life acceptable to these new settlers. Grant wrote in his journal about a scare he got that summer when he heard some 50 mounted Blackfeet yelling on the hill behind his house. They told him they were on their way to trade with the Flatheads. Since before the coming of the horse, these tribes had been enemies. What happened to explain why they would be crossing the divide to trade with ancient foes? Just the year before, in the upper Flint Creek Valley, Blackfeet had stolen horses from a party of Flatheads and whites camped together. The Flatheads pursued them northward, but stopped at the divide. They knew that it meant certain death to them for a small party to go over into the enemy's country, according to Granville Stewart, who was there. If not for a brief mention in a letter written by John Owen, we might assume that Johnny Grant had misunderstood or was misled. Wouldn't it make more sense that these warriors were on a raiding, not a trading mission? After all, Mullan had called the Blackfeet hellhounds. Owen told the superintendent of Indian Affairs that, but a few years ago, we had but one enemy, one common enemy in Blackfeet. They are now quiet, and enemies have grown out of former friendly tribes. Perhaps these Blackfeet, passing behind Grant's cabin, probably from the Small Robe Band, which did have a good trading relationship with Salish, carried bundles of sweetgrass and pemmican to trade and brought their best horses to race against those of their rivals. Grant was on an old Indian highway, with 6 tribes passing his cabin each spring and fall on their way to and from the Bison Plains. This route along the Little Blackfoot was important because it led to the most coveted red paint in the area, so it had long been important. Meriwether Lewis referred to this place along the Missouri as the Crimson Bluffs. The DeSmet map shows 2 major roads in the Clark Fork Basin, and this was limited to his knowledge in the early 1840s, 1841, I believe. So he shows, let's see if I can do this. This is the Bitterroot coming from the headwaters to the Missoula Five Valleys area. And this shows St. Mary's Mission. And then he shows and the dotted lines are the trails. So he shows the one up the Clark Fork, but we can see it continues on. This is the Deer's Lodge. So there's no trail shown up the Blackfoot, and there's no trails shown, not even accurate map of where the Little Blackfoot takes off. His later maps were actually, he traveled with Lewis and Clark maps, and then Stevens and Mullan traveled with his maps, and Stevens actually had asked him to participate, Father DeSmet, to participate in the railroad surveys. He sent him a telegram inviting him, but DeSmet declined. Just a close-up of the lodge of the deer. How many of you have seen the Deer Lodge? How many have never thought about why Deer Lodge is named Deer Lodge? It's fascinating. I hadn't either until doing this research, but behind Warm Springs State Hospital, there is this mineral accretion hot spring. Granville Stewart gives it a really good description in the Deer Lodge in the New Northwest. Can't give you the date. Kim maybe can. But in those days, the valley was, I think, probably so that the deer and horses kept the trees down, and now there's a lot of trees planted around there, so it's hard to see. But you can now imagine in those days that you would come over any rise, and the only thing you would see in this large Deer Lodge Valley would be this lodge. So the name The Lodge of the Deer is actually what the Shoshones called it, and it was because there were often deer licking the minerals around it. And the Salish called it a place where the smoke comes out of the lodge. And so when the Anaconda smelter kind of took over the area, they figured, well, the name was still appropriate. Despite all the traffic, Chief Victor would remind the Stewart brothers in 1862 that the Hellgate Valley was within Salish territory and always had been. It might have been like country roads running through ranches. Others were welcome to travel through this country, but they needed to know they were in Salish territory. The details of the Salish buffalo hunt of 1859 through 60 are unknown. Their last good hunt had been 3 years before. Until then, when bison were plentiful, the camp stayed out for a few months, returning to the Bitterroot Valley loaded with dry meat just after the shortest day of the winter solstice. As game grew more and more scarce, they spent the entire fall and winter on the plains, sometimes over 300 miles away, on the Muscle Shell or the Yellowstone, returning west of the Divide in March or later. Snow was deep in the spring of 1860. Returning hunters and horses all were exhausted from breaking trail when they saw smoke rising from the chimney at Senkoposa, where Johnny Grant and his new wife, Quora, a Shoshone woman, had spent a lonely winter. Years later, when Grant recounted his pioneer years, he made no mention of the Salish passing through, nor whether their horses were weighted down with buffalo meat or simply carrying their own skinny carcasses back to the Bitterroot. Runoff filled the creeks, which filled up the river, obscuring footpaths in all the narrow places. With each leg of the journey back from the bison plains, the Salish hunters saw signs of the whites' commitment to stay put. From Senkoposa to the Bitterroot, their old trail was now the Mullan Road, widened and leveled, yet still without bridges. In October, Johnny Grant's father, Richard, with 300 head of horses and cattle, had settled on the creek that would carry his name, and the first settlement of the Missoula Valley had begun. A steady stream of settlers were moving into the Bitterroot Valley. Imagine the distress of the returning hunters with their exhausted horses to find new cattle herds consuming the spring grasses in the heart of Salish country. There was nothing to do but to keep on, making their living as had hundreds of generations before them. Sweet sap still ran through the cottonwood trees, and the Bitterroot would soon be ready for harvest. And then families would spend the summer following the succession of foods generously provided by the Creator. They would find a progression of ripening bitterroot and biscuit root ready for digging on the dry hills. As they moved into the high country, about the time the magpies lose their tail feathers, the ripe camas would bloom in wet alpine meadows, like a banquet progressing with them. Wild rose flowers, the color of blood in snow. That's what the name means in Salish. They're in bloom when camas is ready in the high country. Toward late summer, when great heaps of berries had been gathered, they would regroup again in the Bitterroot Valley, fattening their horses and gathering supplies once again for the long journey across the mountains. It would be 2 decades later when the plains were empty of bison and the iron horse spewed black smoke through the valley of this ancient road, before relationships became strained enough for the trust between the Salish and the settlers to be openly challenged. In 1859, whites still raved about the sterling qualities of the Flatheads. John Strachan wrote to his brother about the kindness shown by the Indians toward the whites. In November of the following year, the Stewart brothers invited the chiefs of the combined villages of Nez Perce, Yakima, Coeur d'Alene, and Flatheads to dine with them as they passed through en route to Buffalo. Granville Stewart wrote, "We never refused any of these Indians credit for the few things they wanted, such as calico, red cloth for the ladies' leggings, calico shirts, vermilion paint, beads, knives, handkerchiefs, powder, lead, percussion caps, combs, and sometimes blankets. To their honor be it said, they always paid when they passed on their return from the Buffalo Range. We never lost $1 through crediting them, for even if the purchaser was dead or sick, the wife or husband or some relative, as the case may be, came and paid us in buffalo robes, dried meat, dried tongues, skins, or something they had. If a white man came to an Indian's camp, he was always welcome to the best he had without money, to the best they had without money. Owen, as witness to the end of life that had drawn them all there, tried to stem the tide of settlers by alerting government officials about their treaty obligations. He said the Indians have serious objections. They have themselves large bands of animals and say there is not more pasturage than they would like to have for themselves. They very naturally construe the 11th article of the Treaty of 1855 in such a way as to prevent any whites not in service of the Indian Department from settling in the Bitterroot Valley south of the Lolo's Fork. Article 11 directed that a careful survey and examination of the Bitterroot Valley above the Lolo Fork would provide the basis for the president to judge as to whether this area was better adapted to the wants of the Flathead tribe than the general reservation provided for in this treaty. It guaranteed that no portion of the area shall be open to settlement until such examination is had and the decision of the president made known. So from this, it's Stevens' composite map that came out in 57. Let's see. So this is the Flathead Reservation, and then this was the reserved land in the Bitterroot Valley that was to have been surveyed. No survey or examination of the lands had been made, but there was to be no stemming of this tide. Mullan's military road greatly improved travel conditions between Fort Benton and Walla Walla. For the first time, a boat made it all the way to Fort Benton on high water. The name of the creek where Benitzi found gold had been changed to Gold Creek, announcing the discovery which would most dramatically change this world. It was as if the road was constructed and the boats made ready, just in time to bring the miners who would permanently change the face of this landscape. The Salish understood some of what was coming. Some of their own had traveled to St. Louis 20 years before in search of black robes. They had seen roads and the varieties of horse-drawn carts and wagons for which the roads had been built. They had seen how white people built houses in rows, one after another. Some of their leaders traveled to Fort Vancouver and Portland with Father De Smet in the spring of 1860. They had smelled the city with its slop buckets, butcher shops, saloons, and concentrated horse dung, and they marveled at the prison there. But their travels couldn't have prepared them for what this ancient travel corridor would become. They couldn't have imagined that their precious fisheries at the mouths of tributaries would become obliterated by industry. They couldn't have imagined that Senkoposa would become known as Garrison Junction. These names, Senkoposa and Garrison Junction, tell of different worlds. Garrison Junction tells of a world of heroes and rugged individualism, from a culture which names mountains and rivers and towns after outstanding men, wives, and daughters. William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, was somebody's hero. Senkoposa tells of the place itself, where the road splits, from a people finely tuned to the foods and waters and pathways of their homeland. 1 year after Johnny Grant built his lone cabin at the mouth of the Little Blackfoot, the ground had been laid for commerce, American style. The rest of the story is what we call history. Goods and services began to flow into this once remote frontier, and plans for the Northern Pacific Railroad were in the making. 2 decades later, a full-fledged town had grown with a depot and switchyard carrying a name imposed on the landscape like an American flag on the moon. Driving through this junction today, it's clear that this is where the road splits, but little else of the original character remains. The 4 city blocks of Garrison were removed to make room for Interstate 90, built wide enough to land a B-52 bomber. Along with the houses went the potato fields and the life of the town. Few travelers realize that this is a place where 2 rivers join because the confluence is visually obscured by the curving escarpment of highway that leads travelers east to Helena or south through the Deer Lodge Valley to Butte. Today's travelers just drive on by, passing through. It's hard now to hear the Little Blackfoot over the din of fast-turning tires, even when you stand right next to it. It's hard to find the road to what's left of the town of Garrison. It's hard to imagine children playing in the town nestled against what used to be the western flank of the valley, now replaced by the steeply bermed interstate. You can close your eyes and try to reach through the decades to picture the crowds gathered at a horse race on the flat across the Clark Fork. But until you climb atop a hill and get some perspective on the valley, it's hard to imagine children playing around 100 teepees pitched near the mouth of the Little Blackfoot with 1,000 horses grazing nearby. We can't mourn what we don't know we've lost. Garrison Junction tells us nothing of the berries collected there or of the wild rose blossoms like drops of blood in snow. Thank you. So we actually have quite a bit of time for some questions. Anybody have any?
Sally, thank you. That was wonderful. I guess I'm curious, did the Salish ever follow the Blackfoot River and go that direction to the Buffalo?
That's one of the most common trails, and that's, the Nez Perce called it Kokolorishket Trail, but they often traveled together on that route as well. I think it depended on season and whether or not they were going for red paint or which hunting areas seemed to be the richest on the other side. That kind of thing.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Cindy?
I see this lecture for many, many, many groups.
Not just you guys?
No. Montana history.
Yeah.
Lots of people are interested in this.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kim? Well, I asked some Shoshones down at near Pocatello about why there's a Blackfoot River there as well, and they said they named it because that was the raiding route of the Blackfeet, and so that's where they're coming. So maybe the same thing. Anybody know?
It was called that during the Stevens expedition, that early. It was called the Blackfoot River.
I'd have to go dig through some of those old maps that Kim Lughart and I have acquired through the years and see the earliest. It's not in my head right now. Any other questions or comments?
Can you give any background on Sohan's background? He was the artist in residence, obviously, in many circumstances.
Hey, I'm going to defer to the Sohan expert for later. Most of what I know about Sohan is just that he traveled with both Stevens and Mullan and was a very astute person and amazing illustrator and cartographer. But I really know little other than what I've learned from reading what Dan McDermott and Ron Grimm have pulled together through the years. So
I was just thinking maybe he was the origin of MCAT. Professionally. Always being on the scene and illustrating it.
Right. I think you got something there. Maybe a new article.
Another book.
Hey Sally, I am interested in how you feel the Smets map, the accuracy of it, and can you give us a little background on that? Did he create it alone, or were
Oh, you've just opened yourself up to me taking up the additional 15 minutes that we have here. My obsession has been finding all the records of the Rocky Mountain missions, and I've traveled to multiple countries and continents to find the records. And so my interest is always what can we learn about the homeland that they found, rather than less interested in De Smet as a person or the mission of the priests, but he was one brilliant guy. I liken him in some ways to William Clark because he was an incredibly talented cartographer. It is interesting, to read some of the priests that came for the missions stayed and learned the languages and advocated for the tribes, and they really became part of a family of these earliest Jesuits that were here in the 40s and 50s. And de Smet was a madman. He was rarely at the missions. He was traveling like crazy, trying to understand the country, and then back and forth to Europe and St. Louis to raise funds, and really quite a remarkable person. But I had the great fortune of being in St. Louis. I'd done a lot of work at the Midwest Jesuit Archives, they have most of what's in this country from the Rocky Mountain missions. And I was comparing, I went back to St. Louis University. They had donated their collection to the Midwest in the 60s. But I was there for another reason, and I just said, do you happen to have anything related to de Smet or the missions? And they go, oh, there's that box. Okay, any of you who go to archives, the hair starts standing up on the back of your neck at the possibility of what's going to be in this box. And it was mind-blowing. They had not even accessioned this. Nobody had even looked at it, I believe. And they said, oh, here. And I pull out the only known field journal of Father de Smet. I just flabbergasted, and I actually, next year, invite me back. I've got a presentation on that. I am working on a book on this subject. But he, in this field journal, underneath the writing are the maps. So he is doing this as he travels along. This journal covers the same year, which is really funny because I wrote this on the Upper Clark Fork, focused on the year 1859, and the de Smet story is the Lower Clark Fork, 1859-60. It's kind of remarkable, why? So I'm obsessed with this one year in history. But so anyway, he's writing and traveling with, he never names his guides. You have to actually assume he spends time at Coeur d'Alene, gets snowed in at Coeur d'Alene, then goes up to Lake Pend Oreille, and then travels up the Clark Fork in the winter of, they leave in February to head up the Clark Fork. And he's obviously with hunters and people taking care of him. And whether or not they're Pend Oreille, which is my guess, but I don't really know because he never mentions them. That's interesting, that he doesn't acknowledge them. But he does detail camps he sees along the way, and he has every rapid is a fishing place and has a name, and he has those all on these maps, so they're detailed, incredible maps. And then what I surmise about why people don't know about these field journals is that he would then go back to Europe or St. Louis or wherever he had contacts to try to raise money. This field journal had been donated by a wealthy family in St. Louis back to St. Louis University where de Smet was based. And so I think once he had transferred the information onto his main maps and his letters and journals that he published, then he had no need for the journal, and he, I think, used that as a little gift to major donors. So one of my fantasies is traveling around Europe looking for major donors, families. Anyway, I feel very fortunate to have found that and to learn so much about what he did. And then when I look at his maps as a bridge between the Lewis and Clark era and the Mullan, the Stevens, the Pacific Railroad Survey compilations, he was an incredibly talented guy. But he doesn't talk about it the way David Thompson or Clark, what they're doing and how they're getting this. He just, there's no information about how he's doing it. He just was a natural. Thanks for asking. Yes. Yeah, so more of that,
Have you, in the blocks or otherwise, ever found illustrations, paintings, drawings by another Jesuit that was up here in that period, Father Joseph?
I've not seen drawings by Josette. Have you?
Yes, one. It's purportedly of Fort Lewis, which is interesting because it's dated 1846, and that was the year before the logs from Fort Lewis were floated down to build Fort Benton. And this oil painting appeared on eBay about a month or 2 months ago. It's signed Father Joseph and dated 1846. It's of a fort that in some ways resembles Nicholas Point's drawings of Fort Lewis, but it has a brick Catholic church in the center of the compound, which is puzzling. It has an appearing French flag, red, white, and blue, but I can explain that by saying he just, in his crude drawings, didn't get the pendant of the American Fur Company's red, white, and blue flag, which of course was what Fort Lewis was. It was Stewart Junior Company. So what I really am trying to determine is where there are other paintings or illustrations by Joseph, because what I'd like to know, for instance, is how accurate did he try to be? Did he throw things in like a church unreasonably in a fur trading compound or in other drawings? So anyway,
I'd love to see that. Yeah, thank you. A friend of mine in Switzerland tried to see from where Josette was from, if she could track any records, and it's been a dead end. If anybody else knows anything about mysterious documents related to the Jesuit mission, let me know. Other questions or comments? How about contradictions? What I have wrong in this?
I don't have anything wrong, but I was wondering about, Flint Creek, which I'm interested in. Seems to have had that name since time immemorial, and there's Salish oral history related to it. But then you have the Arrowstone River, and that seems to be the Hellgate. But how did he sort out? It almost seems like a contradiction there, or that they're using the same name for two things.
Thank you. And if I've been told in the past that I used too many maps, so I actually took some out that you would have liked. I'm sorry. That in the past, I think because nobody had the whole picture, no Euro-American mind had the whole picture. So segments of, and certainly the tribal names they would change depending on things that happened in different valleys, so the river stretch would be different. But in the early maps of this area, the name changes numerous times as you come down the river. And so Flint Creek, because of Eyebrow Church, how many of you have seen the hill called Eyebrow Church, the Eyebrow Hill? And there's a kind of flakeable material there that was one of the main sources for the Salish and Ponderay as they'd be traveling up the Clark Fork, not too far from Hall in the Flint Creek Valley, or between Hall and New Chicago and a little bit west. And so that's why that's called Flint Creek. Flint is really very similar to Chert, but there's a minor geological difference, and really there's no flint in the New World, according to hardcore people. So the flint hills of England, yes, but what we have is Chert or jasper. Anyway, silicious stone that can be flaked to create stone tools. So then on the river, I almost put the Ferris map, because I think that's the earliest map that shows the arrow stone. So that was an 1840 map that was then never published. Stewart, 100 years later, it was published. Don't give up, right? So anyway, somebody found this map in 1940, Fred Rosenstock in Denver, and published it then. But it would have made a huge difference, because Ferris, as part of the fur trade, had been up these remote tributaries and had really done a good job of mapping there, but nobody had that information to build on. But anyway, on that, he calls it the Arrowstone River below Flint Creek and then down into the Missoula Valley. But then it's the Missoula River, and that was the Salish name for it, for the valley. So a whole different thing, because you weren't thinking about headwaters leading to us, and the ranking of streams and tributaries.
Sally, you made reference to Johnny Grant's cabin. And when I think of Johnny Grant's cabin, I think of Deer Lodge, but he also had a cabin.
The first one, before the Grant Coors area, yeah. And it was rough, the bark's still on cottonwood logs, so in a way not ever thought of as a really long-term investment. That's a pretty cheap, quick way to build a cabin. No, and I, as you can tell from my obsession with the location, have spent a lot of time crawling around and talking to people, but I think because it's been so impacted, there's been very little continuity. Where you go to Flint Creek and you talk to descendants of homestead families who still remember what Salish camped where and when and what they were doing and what they were trading their grandparents for. That was pretty remarkable about how, the consistency there, or the Ovando area, you have people on the ground that really have kept those stories alive, and then they keep the relationships alive. The Garrison, because of so much disruption, I haven't found anyone who knows that. And the historian at Grant Coors who wrote the book, Johnny Grant's Cabin, or Mickle, right? What's her first name? Lindell. She didn't know. I thought if anybody had talked with the right person, but she didn't know. Anybody have an idea? Anybody else? Oh, right. We know how good those are. Okay, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.